The Zelensky experiment is over. I think even the Germans are getting tired of Zelensky. Europe is just a bunch of unruly children. Where is the adult in Europe today? Neutrality makes Switzerland a great nation, not just a great nation, one of the greatest nations. This is the new Russia. This is Vladimir Putin. He is the greatest leader in the history of Russia.
This interview.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Where are you now? Are you in the United States now, or from where are you transmitting?
I am transmitting from my home studio in Del Mar, New York. That's upstate New York, just outside of the state capital of Albany.
Great. Just to start it off, could you quickly introduce yourself to give our viewers and readers an impression that they can, you know, have a picture of yourself?
Well, I've been around for 62 years, so there's a little bit of history here. I was raised as a child of a career Air Force officer, so I grew up around the world. I went to 3 different high schools, one in Hawaii, one in Turkey. I graduated from an American high school in Kaiserslautern, Germany. I enlisted in the Army after graduation because I think being from a military background, given the fact that it was the Cold War, the fact that I graduated from a high school in Germany, right across the border was the Soviet threat, I felt a desire, a need to serve my country. And I left the Army, went to college, got my degree in Russian history, and then was commissioned as an officer in the Marines. I went into the intelligence field. I served in combat arms units, training to fight the Soviet threat. In 1987, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty to get rid of entire classes of nuclear weapons. The Department of Defense was tasked with creating an inspection agency to go in and implement this treaty. And the Marine Corps was tasked with providing officers who spoke Russian and knew something about Russia. But they also wanted people who had the rank of major or lieutenant colonel. I was a lieutenant at the time. But the database showed that they didn't have anybody. I got selected for the job, and so as a junior lieutenant, I was sent off to the Soviet Union to implement arms control treaties. I did a very good job. I have to say I enjoyed the work. I was successful at it. Got a couple classified commendations from the director of the CIA. The Marine Corps viewed my work with great importance. And when I left that job, I went back to the Marine Corps right in time for Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait. And I got caught up in the war. I ended up serving on General Schwarzkopf's staff in Riyadh, where because of my background as a weapons inspector, a missile inspector, I was given the task of trying to hunt down Iraqi Scud missiles that were firing into Israel and in the Arabian Peninsula. And that became my focus during the war. I worked with a variety of units, Special Forces unit, Air Force units, etc. The war ended. At that time, I made a decision that my future would probably not be with the Marine Corps. The Cold War was over. I joined to kill Russians, and we weren't in the Russian killing business anymore. So I was going to get out and pursue civilian life, but I was called by the United Nations. Some of the officers whom I worked for as a weapons inspector were now tasked with implementing the Security Council resolutions calling for the disarmament of Iraq. They were having trouble with the Iraqis. The Iraqis were lying. They weren't turning over what they should. And there was a need to create an intelligence organization within this inspection unit. And I was asked to come in and do this, to build an intelligence organization. I did that. The job took on a life of its own. I became not just an intelligence collector or an assessor, but I became an inspector, an operator. I ran sort of a full service entity to collect information, evaluate it, inspect, come back. I did that for 7 years, leading some of the most controversial and confrontational inspections against the Iraqis. I resigned from my position in 1998, citing American interference in the work of the inspectors. And then from that point on, I became critical of American policy. Leading up to the 2003 decision to invade Iraq, I publicly made the case that there were no weapons of mass destruction left in Iraq worthy of an invasion, that Iraq had been fundamentally disarmed by the teams that I was involved in. We went to war anyways. I was proven to be correct. And then ever since then, I've taken upon myself to criticize U.S. policy where it needs to be criticized. I'm a very loyal American, patriotic American. I think I've shown I'm willing to die for my country. But the key aspect of being an American is to recognize what you're serving. You don't serve a president. You don't serve a government. You serve the people. And the people is best served by adherence to the Constitution of the United States of America. And when we have governments that implement policies that deviate from the principles, the values of the letter of the law, then it's the duty and responsibility of a patriotic American to speak out. And so that's what I do today. I speak out where needed. And right now, my focus of effort is on the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where I find American policy to be sadly wanting.
What is the most important thing you have learned throughout your career, your experiences in on the battlefield and as a UN inspector, intelligence officer? What is the most important thing you have learned about international conflicts and diplomacy? What's the sum of your...
Some of my knowledge.
Yeah.
That war should be the absolute last resort. That wars rarely achieve what they set out to achieve. They always result in death and destruction, and they always result in a situation that's worse coming out than it was going in. That the best option for the endeavors of nations are to prevent wars through diplomacy, that we should invest money in diplomacy, and we should be honest about diplomacy, meaning that right now, sometimes I believe that diplomatic tools are used to facilitate warfare, to set up the conditions for war, as opposed to ensuring that the conditions for war never exist. And so I believe that diplomacy must be given a chance, but it has to be honest diplomacy. I think I've also learned that my country is the number one problem in the world today. The way my country interfaces with the rest of the world, we interface as a singular hegemon, where we insist that the world revolve around an exceptional America. And I've learned that there's no such thing as American exceptionalism, that the rest of the world has a vote. The rest of the world is populated by human beings who have shared values. Every human has shared values. We want to live. We want things good for our kids. We want a better future, and that future should be a future that's shrouded by peace, not war. And so, that's it. Diplomacy, and that America needs to do a better job of being diplomatic.
Mm-hmm. How close are we now to a third world war, looking at the situation in the Ukraine?
The Ukrainian conflict, as it is being won by Russia. And that's a problem for the United States and Europe, because we've been setting up this conflict for decades now with the intent of defeating Russia. And Russia's upended that entire calculus, which means that the entire national security and foreign policy strategies of the United States, NATO, Europe are no longer valid. And when you invalidate, national security visions on this scope and scale, you create a feeling of existential risk. And right now we have a situation in the United States and Europe that perceives a Russian victory in Ukraine as being a threat of existential proportions. And there is active talk about, the need to use nuclear weapons. The Russians, on the other hand, aren't going to use nuclear weapons preemptively, but have said that if nuclear weapons are used against them, that they will respond with the totality of their capabilities, which would mean general nuclear war, the end of the world. the fact that we have the United States reflecting on what opportunities could exist for the use of nuclear weapons at a time when the Russians have said, if you use nuclear weapons, we will kill everything, means that we are in a very dangerous situation. I say that some people say that this is the worst it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I say it's worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis because the Cuban Missile Crisis was a controlled crisis. Both parties knew what they were getting into going in. The Soviets wanted American Jupiter missiles out of Turkey and Italy, and the Americans wanted Soviet SS-4 and SS-5 missiles out of Cuba. And there was a quid pro quo arrangement, even though the American withdrawal of missiles was kept secret. It was controlled crisis. It was dangerous, don't get me wrong, but it was controlled. There was an end game that both parties could agree to. Right now, we have an uncontrolled crisis with an end game that both parties don't agree to. The United States and Europe are not in a position at this point in time to accept the reality of a Russian victory. And so, until these nations, the collective West, so to speak, is able to understand that the reality is Russia has won and to comprehend what that means and then adapt accordingly, if they're going to struggle against the inevitability of a Russian victory at a time when nuclear weapons become the only last remaining weapon to prevent this, we're in danger of there being a nuclear war, especially when the strategists in the United States and Europe openly talk about a limited nuclear war, tactical nuclear weapons. We can escalate to de-escalate. This is all nonsense. There's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. A tactical use of a tactical nuclear weapon will lead inevitably to the release of strategic nuclear weapons, which will in turn lead to the destruction of the planet.
Why are you saying Russia has won this war? If I look at our media in Switzerland, in Germany, I get a totally different picture. The journalists are writing, well, there are some difficulties in the Ukraine offensive. The former British Prime Minister has just written a great essay after his travels to Kiev, saying that the Ukraine can still win this war. We have to move up our assistance. We have to send even more weapons. In Germany, the Chancellor is thinking about sending these bunker breaking missiles. How do you come to the conclusion that Russia has won this war? And why do our media and politicians continue to say the opposite?
Well, I can answer the second part first. Your media and your politicians are lying, and they know they're lying. Straight up know they're lying. A former British Prime Minister writing this essay, he wrote it for political effect, not because he's telling the truth. He's a liar. And I would tell any one of your reporters to their face, they're liars. And if they challenge me, I'll say, I'll tell you what, come with me. The next time Germany provides a shipment of modern weaponry to Ukraine, come with me. Let's get on one of those tanks. Let's ride it to the front and let's join the victorious Ukrainian army that you write so, because clearly you interact with them. You've been to the front line, right? You've been in the leading element of the attack. You've seen this great Ukrainian victory. Ride with me to victory. Let's go. None of them will do it because they all know what the result will be. They'll be dead before they get there because that's the reality. Every one of your reporters are liars. Every one of their editors are liars. And again, please sue me. Sue me for defamation. I will take you to court. I will insist on full disclosure, and you will go down in flames because you're liars, every one of you. And a word you write is true. Is the Russians are prevailing on the battlefield. They're slaughtering the Ukrainians. This is why your reporters won't go to the front line because they'll be dead reporters. This is the statement of fact. The Russians have defeated the Ukrainian army. To provide bunker busting missiles. Is this a new concept? Did Germany invent bunker busting missiles? I'm just curious because I imagine the Russians have never heard of bunker busting missiles. So therefore, when they're used by the Ukrainians against the Russians, this will be a miracle weapon that will cause the Russians to panic and surrender and the war will be over. Or is this missile actually well known to everybody? It's been around. It has a limited utility. It will kill some Russians, but the end result will be nothing. Because in war, people die. Weapons kill people. This is not a miracle weapon. Didn't the Germans learn about that? Didn't you believe at one point in time that the V1 and V2 were miracle weapons, that if you use them against the British, they would surrender? How'd that work out for you? It didn't work out very well. None of your weapons are miracle weapons. There's no such thing as a miracle weapon. What is a miracle are the troops in the weapons. They make the weapons work. And right now, the Russian troops are 10 times better than the Ukrainian troops, not because the Ukrainian troops don't have heart or courage, but how can you man these miracle weapons provided by the West when you have 21 days basic training and maybe 5 more weeks of advanced training? What does it take to train a German soldier? I imagine it's more than 21 days. And if you have a German soldier involved in complex combined arms warfare, I would imagine it would take about 1.5 to 2 years to train that soldier. Why does Germany believe that the Ukrainian soldiers can do in 2.5 months what it takes the Germans 2 years to accomplish in terms of training? This is why Ukraine is losing the war, because Germans have caused their defeat. British have caused their defeat. Americans have caused their defeat because we're asking them to do something they literally cannot do. How long does it take to train a Leopard tank operator to be competent in all aspects of tactical warfare? A heck of a lot longer than the Ukrainian forces were trained on them. And yet you're asking them to take this tank and lead it in to a combat assault breaching operation, the most complex form of offensive military action ever, without the training, the experience, or the familiarity with the equipment. Shame on Germany. Shame on Europe. Shame on America. You're responsible for the deaths of 500,000 Ukrainian men. I hope everybody hangs their head in shame when that awful reality sets in on them.
And what do you think about the following statement? I've read it, and I'm sure you know it. Skeptics, people have a similar view as you. They say the West will never allow the Ukraine to lose this war. That means they cannot accept a Russian victory because they have invested so much capital, political capital, financial capital. The United States, the whole government has supported it. We have elections. I mean, what's going to happen on this front? Will the West continue in spite of this, according to you, victory of the Russians? Will they just not let happen? Will they just not let this defeat happen? Will they somehow, what will they do?
Well, let's start off by noting this. In the year leading up to the defeat in Afghanistan, remember that one? America got beat, NATO got beat, Germany got beat too. Everybody got beat by the Taliban of all people. But we were told we will never allow the Taliban to win. It will never happen. We've spent billions. We've invested everything. Victory, 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 victory. Same thing's going to happen in Ukraine. Because let me ask question and response. What can NATO and Europe do? I mean, to say we can't allow the Russians to win, what can you do to prevent that? Are you going to sanction Russia more? How's that working out, Germany? It's your economy that's in free fall. Deindustrialization has gripped your economy. It's your people who've lost the energy subsidy this winter because your government's bankrupt. How did sanctions work out for Germany? I can tell you how they worked out for Russia because I just came back from Russia. 26 days, 12 cities. The Russian economy is booming. Booming. They ain't going to be cold this winter. Their refrigerators aren't going to be empty. They're going to be doing A-OK. Why? Because sanctions don't work. They've backfired on Germany, on Europe. So what is Germany going to do? Sanction Russia some more? Please. I think the Russians are begging you to, because apparently every time you sanction Russia, they get stronger, you get weaker. So we know that sanctions don't work. Political isolation, because Germany has taken the moral high ground here, and the world is rallying behind Germany to say, you are right, the Russians are wrong, we are with you, Germany. Or is it that everybody's looking at saying, hey, did you guys do this once before? I remember a couple of decades ago, you strapped on some uniforms, you rode in big tanks that had funny cat-like names. I know, Panther, Tiger. You rode them east towards Russia, and you fought in Ukrainian fields before, and you got beat. And outside of the Reichstag today, I believe there's monuments that have T-34-85 tanks on them that are symbolic of the Soviet army coming in and destroying the Nazi regime. And so, haven't you learned anything? I mean, I believe there's a graveyard in Germany that contains the body, the last mortal remains of Stepan Bandera. You know who he is. He's a Nazi supporting thug who murdered tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. His supporters did. He fled to Germany and was brought under the wing of the German intelligence service, which was really nothing more than an extension of the Gehlen organization, which was a Nazi intelligence organization that ran the Banderas in Ukraine when the Nazis were there. But now they've been reanointed and they've told, you're okay. I think the ugly truth is that Germany's never really shed itself of its Nazi past, because if it had, Germans wouldn't be so willing to see German tanks with another cat name going to battle in Ukraine against the Russians. Germans should be hanging their head in shame, saying, no, we're not going to do this. What is Germany going to do? Mobilize the German army. What German army? That's in all sincerity, what German army? Is there anything to be mobilized? My understanding is that the Germans, to get a tank battalion reinforced, sent up to be part of the NATO battle group in Lithuania. Again, the idea of German tanks in Lithuania should make people sick to their stomachs. But today the Germans are going, that's normal. It's not normal, by the way, to have German tanks in Lithuania. Bad thing, bad look, bad history. But you had to scrap and cannibalize all your other units to make that happen. Now there's talk about Germany rebuilding its military, 100 billion euro to make the new strong German army. To do what? March through Poland to fight Russians. Didn't you do that before already? You got beat. You're going to get beat again if you try, but you're not going to be able to do it, because in order to do that, you have to have an industrial base. My understanding is that your companies are shutting down because they can't afford to keep working because of high energy costs. You're deindustrializing, unemployment, etc. Oh, yeah, that $100 billion or euro military, you're not going to be able to do it. I think the German government has come back and quietly told NATO, we can't do the 2% GDP thing you want us to do because we're bankrupt. We have no money. We got nothing. So I come back to you, Germany and NATO and the United States. So you keep saying you can't accept a Russian victory, but you have no option but to accept it because you've lost. You've been beat. You're not going to win. The Russians are, and there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing you can do about it.
So what do you think? How will this now play out in the next few months? Will we see then a formal armistice or some kind of negotiations, or what is your expectation for the near future? What will happen?
Well, I can't put I'm hesitant to put a timeline on it because the Russians don't put a timeline on it. They're objective driven. The war will end when Russia wins the war. That's it. And that's the difference, you see, because in Germany, everybody's going, right, can we be done by this point? If we give them assistance here, we can be finished by the spring. Do we have to fund it to the Russians are saying that people go, well, Russia, when's the war going to end? When we win. When's that going to be? When we win. But I mean, give me when we win. That's it. That's the difference. The Russians will win because that's their objective. Everybody else is putting artificial calendar-driven things. But the fact of the matter is, the war ends when two things happen. One, the Ukrainian army no longer is capable of fighting in a coherent fashion, and they're rapidly approaching that point right now. Their last strategic reserves have been expended. They're getting 31 M1 Abrams tanks. I think the Russians are ready to surrender right now. The fact is, I'm pretty sure Vladimir Putin just called up Joe Biden and said, 31 M1 tanks, when can we sit down and negotiate the terms of our surrender? I'm ready to give up today because it's 31 M1 tanks. You've never heard of the M1 before. It's a miracle weapon. No, it's not. It's been around forever. Old tank. It's not very good. The armor that they put on it isn't even good armor. It's the butter armor. The Russian munitions are going to cut through it like a hot knife through butter and kill everybody inside, which again is something that everybody tends to forget. That when these weapons fail in combat, it usually results in dead Ukrainian soldiers. But the Russians aren't worried about any of this. The Russians are going to defeat the Ukrainian army strategically. That point is coming, but the war won't end until there's a political resolution. The Russians have made it clear that Ukraine will never join NATO. So as long as there's a Ukrainian government that says we are going to join NATO, that means that the war ends when that Ukrainian government is kaput, finished, gone. We're getting close to that today. The Zelensky experiment is over. Poland has said no. I think even the Germans are getting tired of Zelensky. His wife I don't know if you saw the 60 Minutes interview that she gave just recently. An exhausted woman who talked about the political future, saying she's not certain that the Ukrainian people will continue to want Zelensky to be their president in upcoming elections. Now, I've seen a lot of politicians' spouses when they're interviewed on the verge of an election campaign. They're all upbeat. My husband's going to win. He's great. The people love him. She was all defeated. The Zelensky era is over. He's doomed. He's collapsing as we speak. And when he collapses, that which replaces him will probably be inclined to bring an end to this war. This war, if there is a negotiation, the negotiation resemble what occurred on the deck of the USS Missouri, a battleship in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, where the Japanese were brought in, stood before a table, and compelled to sign surrender document without conditions. It was unconditional surrender. And that's the future for Ukraine. At some point in time, a Ukrainian official will appear before a Russian delegation, documents will be on the table, and they'll be handed a pen. They'll be told to sign, document, it's over. And they will have no say in what's in that document because they have been defeated strategically. That's the reality. The day and age of negotiation has passed. I remind your audience that in March of 2022, the Russians had engaged in extensive negotiation with the Ukrainians, and they had a peace plan in hand, initialed by everybody. And it was ready to be finalized on 1 April in Istanbul. And it was NATO, through that same British prime minister, who wrote that wonderful article talking about the need to continue. Yes, Boris Johnson. He's the guy that flew in and said, no, don't do peace because NATO's behind you. We're going to back you. How does that work out? The day of negotiations over. The Russians will not negotiate. There will be no ceasefire. There will be no frozen conflict. The war is over. Europe, you lost. Get used to it.
What do you think is the game plan of the American government, of this American government? I mean, it's puzzling. I'm not against the United States. You are not against the United States, but probably we both are very skeptical and critical about the direction of the American foreign policy, let's say till 1990, after they won the Cold War, basically. What's your explanation that the United States have created this situation where Russia was somehow provoked into this war? I mean, is that serious foreign policy? Is this Zbigniew-Brzezinski, the great chessboard kind of geopolitical maneuvering, or is this kind of shallow idealism? Is it not clear-cut thinking? What's your explanation of the American strategy towards Russia, and how will it play out now? Will the Americans just change course? Will they sooner or later admit we've lost? Okay, let's run off, or let's call it off, as we did in Afghanistan, as we did with Georgia. Please explain to us the United States of America.
Well, I would say that we start off as reluctant superpowers. If you take a look at, Theodore Roosevelt was the first American president that sought a global presence.
The Rough Rider.
The Rough Rider. And I love Theodore Roosevelt, but, he built the big American fleet and it sailed around the world. And, but his philosophy was speak softly and carry a big stick, meaning we're not here to yell at you or anything, but if you want to mess with us, we'll beat you over the head because we're America. Beginning of American sea power. World War I came. Wilson got America involved in that war on the side of Great Britain, an empire, against the Germans, an empire. A lot of Americans believe we fought for the wrong side at that time. Maybe, but it doesn't matter. We did what we did. But we emerged from that with a feeling of Europe was exhausted by conflict. And the United States was this power that suddenly had, it was still a young power, an immature power, but, we were flexing our muscles. We suddenly realized, hey, we're pretty strong. We got some muscles. You guys are a bunch of old men who were all beat up after this war. League of Nations, we talked about, values and all this stuff, but it didn't quite work. The world wasn't ready for that. And America went into a period of isolationism. leading up to the Second World War. We were strong economically, but we didn't want to get involved in this global war stuff. That was your business. The Japanese and the Chinese was their business. Europe was your business.
It was not the Swiss business. It was not the Swiss business. We Swiss, we stayed out of all the wars. Of course.
Or what we could say is it was all your business. Meaning
well, yeah, it was forced upon us. It was forced upon us. The
what I mean is
of our neighbors was forced upon us.
And you gladly assisted in the banking operations to help this, but
here I had to intervene fiercely, but I don't want to interrupt you. Please continue.
No. First of all, I'm saying that with a smile on my face because I'm not an expert.
Sure. Otherwise, I would have just called my lawyer. I would have just called my lawyer and my 2 bodyguards. But of course, your smile saved the situation.
Thank you. You have 2 bodyguards. You might need 3. But
well, they're hiding now.
Okay. No, but the point is, the United States was reluctantly brought into the war. Now, President Roosevelt was more aggressive. He, of course, had Lend-Lease. He had the aggressive patrolling in the Atlantic, and some people accuse him of creating the condition that facilitated a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. The Japanese attacked us because we were trying to prevent them from getting oil and things of that nature. But the point is, we were thrust into this war, the global war. And again, while we suffered casualties, while we paid a price economically in terms of lost material, et cetera, we were untouched. Other than Pearl Harbor getting bombed, American soil, I think we got an Aleutian island, Attu and Kiska, up there in the Aleutians in Alaska. The Japanese landed on that too. And I think a Japanese submarine launched an airplane that dropped a couple paper bombs on us. But other than that, we were untouched. Europe, meanwhile, is destroyed, devastated. Asia laid to waste. At the end of the war, America was the big power economically. And through Bretton Woods agreement, we created a system of dominance, global dominance. And we continued to do that and use that, especially as we morphed into the Cold War. You know, the Cold War didn't need to be fought. It was actually a war that was premised on Winston Churchill's prejudice against the Russians, and then Kennan being an American diplomat who wrote the long telegram. Kennan. He wrote a telegram that everybody misunderstood and misquoted, and he was talking about economic conflict. Everybody, people like Paul Nietzsche came in. He wrote National Security Document 68, NC 68. That became the containment strategy. But we didn't need to have a Cold War, but we did it. And one of the reasons why is that we needed an enemy, because the American economy that had been in depression. Remember, we had this horrible depression in the 1930s, and we were pulled out of that depression largely because of World War II. Now we have this powerful economy, but in order to justify these continued expenditures, we needed an enemy so we could keep the economy on a near war footing. That enemy became international communism, the Soviets, the communist Chinese. And so we create what today we call a rules-based international order to govern the world that we controlled. We had everybody tied to us economically. The dollar was the reserve currency. We called the shots. We controlled all of the World Bank and the IMF, and we controlled I think the Swiss were trying to control behind the scenes with their banking. I'm joking again, but we were played
some discreet part in these
discreet, yes, very discreet. But with the secret Swiss bank accounts, which I never got involved in, I much to my regret. But maybe I have a.
You have to go to Delaware today for that.
Today, yeah, the Delaware corporations, yeah. But again, in all seriousness, we had this massive system that was designed to defeat world communism, the Cold War, and then the Cold War ended. But what's interesting about the Cold War ending, because you talked about Brzezinski and chess. Mm-hmm. In chess and chess competitions, it's not just what happens on the board. They have a clock, and so it's timed. And you can lose one of two ways. They can checkmate you, or you can run out of time. Mm-hmm. And the West is like, we beat the Soviets, checkmate. Never happened. There was never checkmate. What happened is the Soviets ran out of time.
And ran out of money.
Well, that's what I mean. I'm symbolically talking about running out of time, meaning that it wasn't a defeat of the ideology. It said it was an economic defeat. brought on by not by external pressures, but internal. The fact that the Soviet system just wasn't working, whether it's you want to call it corruption or whatever, it just wasn't working. So it collapsed. At that point in time, a true leader would have said, for instance, if you're a businessman and you have a business model, that business model is predicated on certain realities, and then the world changes. A good businessman says, time out on our current business model. What do we have to do to adapt the current business model to the new realities? And then we will transition with these realities and we will take a leadership role and we'll become something different. The United States had an opportunity with the collapse of the Soviet Union to do just that, to say, time out, what are the new realities? How do we go forward from here? But instead we said, we won. We're the greatest chess players in the world. We won. So rather than change things, we're just going to try and take the system and impose it on the world. Impose the rules-based international order on the rest of the world using NATO expansion and all this stuff. And that's why we're in the situation today, because we've never been willing to change with the world. And right now, because the world has changed so much, we have no choice. We will change. Even the Biden administration, whose 2022 national security strategy document is, again, founded throughout the document in the notion that the rules-based international order is necessary for the functioning of liberal democracies around the world, and that the world is attracted to the American model of liberal democracy, and we must keep it strong. But now the Biden, I think Tony Blinken just came out and said, yeah, it looks like the rules-based international order is not as popular. People aren't buying into it. We might have to do something different. And so we're being compelled to change. And we will change. That's the reality of the United States, is we have no choice but to change. And it's going to get ugly because we're not going to change. See, if we had changed in 1991, 1992, it would have been benevolent change, meaning that we're changing for the betterment of everybody, including ourselves. Today, it's defensive change. We are in a defensive crouch because we have failed. And so as we change, we're going to be looking to hold on to what we can. And this is where Europe has to be a little nervous here, because we're going to hold on to Europe as an American colony. We're not going to call it a colony, but you're going to exist to provide an outlet for the dollar. We're going to destroy the euro. And then we're going to make Europe addicted to the dollar and the European economy tied to the dollar, tied to America. We're going to do the same in South America. We're trying to carve up our own little corner of the world while China and Russia take the rest of the world, India, et cetera, and Swiss banks.
Mm-hmm. Would you go so far as to say that the United States, as this victorious hegemon after the Cold War, is today a threat to world peace?
Yes, absolutely. We're the greatest threat to world peace, because the world is transitioning away from the American singularity to a multipolar reality. We see that with BRICS. We see that with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We see that with even the G20, which is nothing more than a tool of the G7, which is a tool of America. But even the G20 is starting to say, we want a little bit of independence. I think they'll get their independence when they dissolve the G20 and they just accept that BRICS is the thing. But it's a multipolar world taking place out there. The United States could say, we want to be part of that multipolar world, meaning, but and America's so big and strong that when we walk in, the world's going to have to listen to us, not obey us, but listen to us. Mm-hmm. It's just a new way of interacting. Real leaders don't go in and order people to follow them. A real leader steps in the room and people say, I want to follow you. And so if America was a nation with true leadership, we would accept multipolarity and we would step into the room and people would look at us and say, I like that, I want to follow it. But that's not what we're doing. We're ordering people to follow us. And the world doesn't want to. We're becoming increasingly isolated in the world today. And as a result, because of our strength, we will lash out. We are the greatest threat to international peace and security, either through direct military intervention or the fact that we're running around the world and sticking our fingers in and stirring problems up, trying to weaken other people.
Mm-hmm. You have been to the Soviet Union. you have just been in Russia. You have studied as an officer, as an intelligent specialist, and I guess also as a UN inspector. You have studied the Russian leadership. You know the history of Russia. What's your assessment of Vladimir Putin? Vladimir Putin was this torchbearer of a new modernized Russia. He was the hope. He was in Germany. He got the standing ovation for his speech at the Bundestag. He was considered a man of the West, a man of St. Petersburg. And now we are reading in our newspapers, we get it from your leaders, from our leaders, that Putin is almost as bad as Hitler. He's this walking devil on earth. He is this huge threat of autocracy, of dictatorship, and we have to destroy him in order to preserve our democracies. I mean, what's your assessment of Vladimir Putin? What role does he play in this international order? What are his qualities? And what are his shortcomings according to your perception?
I mean, that's a tall order. I'll give you an assessment. I'm not avoiding the question, but I do want to preface it by saying I've never met Vladimir Putin. I've never had the opportunity to speak with him. And it's very difficult sometimes to answer a question like the one you answered unless you can sit across from somebody, look in their eyes, look at the body language and stuff. You can get a good assessment of somebody when you do that. So I'm doing this long distance, etc. So there's a little bit of a caveat here. But let me start by pointing out, before I judge Vladimir Putin as a person and as a leader, we have to talk about the times in which Putin achieved political maturity. He started out in the late 1980s. He was a KGB officer, reached the rank of lieutenant colonel. He was stationed in East Germany at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. He returned to St. Petersburg as part of a Soviet Union in collapse. And he left the intelligence service trying to transition in as an aide to the mayor of St. Petersburg, Sobchak. This is in the decade of the 1990s when literally Russia is in free fall collapse. It is bad. And people who claim to be trying to help Russia are actually just trying to dismember Russia, to enrich themselves from the wealth of Russia, but take it all out of Russia, leave nothing left for Russia, to weaken Russia. This is the environment. He was not what we call a shot caller back then. A shot caller is a boss, somebody who calls the shots. Sobchak was a shot caller. Yeltsin was a shot caller. Putin worked for shot callers. Sobchak had a reputation. All Russian leaders had a reputation because you're living in a nation in decline, a society in collapse, an economy that's in tatters. So everybody's in survival mode. And what happens when you get into survival mode? The norms and standards of the niceties of a legal structure go out the window, because you can sit there and argue, well, you have to comply with paragraph 12C3A on page 42. And they're going to say, if I comply with that, I'm going to starve to death. Yes, but it's the rules. It's the law. Yeah, but I'm going to starve to death. Yeah. Shoot the guy with the law book, take his food, eat it. Now you're not starving to death. You're alive. Russia was in survival mode. So ugly times. And it only got worse. The best year in post-Cold War Russia was 1992. The worst year was 1999. All right, it got worse. And what's the connectivity there? Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin was a horrible leader. He wasn't democratic. No democratic leader puts tanks in the streets of Moscow to fire on the Russian parliament as he did in October of 1993. He wasn't reflective of the will of the Russian people, or else the United States wouldn't have gone in 1996 and buy an election. We bragged about it, by the way. Nice Time magazine cover, best election money can buy. He was surrounded by hugely corrupt people. The oligarch class was raised during this time by the West, by the way. We're the ones who created the oligarch class to facilitate the economic rape of Russia. Everything's fallen apart. If you were a pensioner, you lost your pension. If you're somebody who had a medical need, you lost your medical care. There was very little medical care. The soldiers weren't getting paid, so the quality of the army was collapsing. Infrastructure wasn't being built because people putting it in their pocket or taking it out. So the entire society was in collapse. That's the reality of Russia at that time. You know, I'm not going to sit here and sing the praises of Vladimir Putin. He survived the 1990s. What I will ask people is, could you have survived the 1990s? And if so, what would you have done to survive? And there's not too many Westerners that can answer that question. I'll tell you this. We have relatives. My wife has family that was in Russia at the time. They'd be dead today. Dead. That's a father, a mother, and their 2 children would have died if we hadn't sent them money every month to survive. Because Russia was incapable of sustaining life for many people. There's some figures out right now that talk about the number of lives lost during the 1990s, either as a direct or indirect result of the collapse of Russian society. And some of those numbers run as high as 20 million people. 20 million people died because of the collapse of Russian society. So we're talking about a nightmare scenario, apocalyptic kind. And Vladimir Putin is coming into political maturity. Now, did he cut some deals? Did he do this? Did he do that to survive? Maybe. I don't have evidence. Maybe he did. Maybe he did. Does it make him an evil person? Nope. Makes him a survivor. What I do know is this. When there were NGOs, non-governmental organizations, going into St. Petersburg in the 1990s, when Vladimir Putin was an aide to Sobchak, and there have been several people who have spoken about this, they said, we were used to going into the mayor's office and we'd have a meeting with one of the aides because we wanted to get permission to do a deal or something like that. We'd come in and we'd brief the aide. They said they were always bored. They just, and then they'd get up and they'd leave. But before they left a number on a piece of paper. That was the amount of rubles or dollars that had to go into an envelope. Then they'd come back and you'd give a pitch, and then he'd take the envelope, look at it, and then say, okay, sign the paper and go. So she said she went to a meeting, and Vladimir Putin shows up. Never met the guy before. And she said the first thing is he listened as she talked. She said he sat there and he listened to everything. Every once in a while, he'd interrupt her and ask a question, and the question was relevant, which means he's not just going through the motions of listening, he's actually listening, and he's thinking, and he's asking questions. And then he said, I'm going to take a break. But when he left the room, there was no number on the table, and she was confused. She didn't know what to do, because normally at this point, you're reaching in your briefcase to pull out the money to put in an envelope, and there's no envelope, there's no number. What does she do? She's in a panic. And the door opens up, Putin comes back, and he asks some follow-on questions. And then he says, look, I like your idea. I think it could be good, St. Petersburg, but we're not ready for it yet. We need to get up to a certain level that we're not there yet. He said, I've got your contact information. When we get there, I'm going to invite you back in, and maybe then we could talk about doing business. But until then, it was a pleasure to meet you. If you have anything more, don't hesitate to come. And they parted. No money involved. He's incorruptible. That doesn't mean that he didn't cut a deal here or there to survive. Everybody in that environment did. There's not a pure person in Russia during that time. You had to live. But when it came to doing his job, his task, it was pure. And Sobchak recognized that. That's why he got sent up to Yeltsin. Now, in 1999, Boris Yeltsin is on the downslide. He's done. He knows that his health is declining. And he also realizes at this point in time that he's made huge mistakes. Russia is destroyed. And he's looking for who's going to govern. And there's a whole bunch of people surrounding him who wanted that job. Primakov and others. They were just waiting. Who did he turn to? Vladimir Putin. And he said, Putin, I want you to be president. And Putin, you know what his answer was? I'm not ready. I don't want the job. I don't want the job. And he also said, you have to take the job because you're the only one who can do this. And he took the job. Why? Because he was the only person there who cared about Russia more than he cared about himself. That's the whole thing about Vladimir Putin that everybody gets wrong. They think that he was going to be another corrupt Russian politician, that the West could come in. I mean, you know why your people gave him the standing ovation? Because you thought his name was Boris Yeltsin. You thought that what you were listening to is a younger version of Boris Yeltsin who's going to play the game it was always played. And you were anticipating that. But nobody listened to Putin. You know what the first thing Putin did after he was sworn in as president? He got on a helicopter and he flew to Chechnya, where they had a war going on. He celebrated New Year's with the frontline soldiers.